Good morning, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the 5th Belgrade Security Forum. My name is Rihards Bambals, and it's my true pleasure to address such distinguished panelists next to me and the audience in front of me, us today. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to organizers and co-sponsors of the event for inviting me as a moderator for the first panel of today's conference. Named Rethinking EU's Foreign Policy. Special thank you goes out to Ms. Isidora Stakic for putting this all together and for inviting me, and also for Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. I would like to start by introducing myself, then provide an introduction on today's topic and presentations ahead, to lastly introduce all the panelists and discussants and to give floor to them. Each of them will be given 10 to 12 minutes for presentations, and afterwards our discussant will sum up what's been said today, and it will be followed by a question and answer session in which you will be able to ask questions not only to panelists but also to our keynote speaker of today's session. So a couple of words about myself. Currently, I'm a PhD candidate of political sciences at University of Latvia, working on a dissertation in which I research how to measure the human security changes in different societies after sudden external shocks, such as, for example, but not necessarily only, natural hazards. I also have a background of research of the EU and NATO politics and transformation of modern warfare. Lastly, having something as can be said as double life, I'm also a career diplomat at Latvian Foreign Service, although my views today should not be seen as the position of Latvian national government. A couple of ideas on today's topic. Does the EU need a foreign policy? Does the EU have it? And why bother at all? To start with, the EU, admit we or not, is a major player on global stage. It is the largest market, producing 1/4 of the world's GDP, and it is the largest exporter-importer of services. It's the largest development donor, providing over half of the world's development aid. It has impressive global presence with 139 delegations abroad in the world, with over 3,500 diplomats exercising its foreign policy on a daily basis. And lastly, the EU has over 7,000 soldiers and civilian experts deployed in over a dozen missions and operations abroad. And yet, the EU is often criticized for lack of strategicness and unity. Although, since 2009, the EU has its own diplomatic service and even a foreign minister, as can be said as HRVP Mogherini qualifies for that position, they are often accused of exercising 29 different separate policy instead of representing 28 members. Some of the reasons will be explained in presentations today, as I am led to believe. And yet, it is most obvious to see this lack of strategicness and unity when it comes to the domain of security and defense. The EU has no joint armed forces or so-called European army. Moreover, over a decade from 2003 to 2013, defense spending gap between the EU and US has widened. And if we see and compare, it's the gap between EU and China and Russia, it has closed. If in 2003 the EU spent exactly 1/2 of the US and 6 times more than China and 12 times more than Russia, then in 10 years on, in 2013, the EU spent only 43.5% of the US share, while China was committing 2/3 and Russia 1/3 of what the EU did. Likewise, the previously effective multilateralism that worked so well for the EU and was one of the EU's trump cards is often deadlocked, as proved by Russia's or China's actions in the UN Security Council, vis-à-vis Ukraine or Syria. And the old carrots in form of development aid or enlargement are no more as effective when dealing with instability in the neighborhood. And Russia and other contestant powers are challenging Europe's own unity from the outside with illustrations of the energy supply deals and financing for left and right-wing parties within the EU. And when it comes to defense, the EU is divided from the inside, as it is seen still as a matter of sovereignty, and all decisions in this domain are still accepted unanimously. Quoting Daniel Keohane regarding EU defense politics, France is often caught between German reluctance to use force and British reluctance to use the EU. And it all happens right when the EU is facing Russia's aggression against Ukraine, tensions in Syria, and instability in Northern Africa, as well as migration crisis, a perfect storm. As you may have noticed in my speech so far, what the EU lacks is not foreign policy, but it starts lacking its credibility as a major global actor. An explanation for this is quite obvious. Although the EU has hardware installed, the major stakeholders have forgotten to install software in the EU foreign policy. Luckily for us, the perfect storm could be survived, as the HRVP has been mandated to produce a first-ever EU global strategy by mid-2016. Those of us closely following the process know that HRVP is keen to listen to the input from academia, NGOs, and business community, from fora as you all today here. Therefore, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers of today who will share their ideas on the EU foreign policy. First of all, I would like to introduce a discussant right next to me, Dr. Jozef Bátora, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Comenius University in Slovakia. He holds a PhD in Political Sciences from University of Oslo, has been a visiting professor at FFSI at Stanford University, as well as he's been a senior researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and at Arena at University of Oslo. He has published extensively, and his most current work includes a book on the European External Action Service, European Diplomacy Post-Westphalia from Belgrade, 2015. And he's been having... Co-edited with David Spence, as I'm being told. And we'll be having a presentation of this book today.
Absolutely.
Yes, so you all will be able to attend book presentation later on this day. So then I'd like to introduce all our panelists, starting from the far right side, from me. Dr. Roozbeh Baker, who is a lecturer at University of Surrey, United Kingdom. He's teaching on public law, international law, and multi-method research design. He has graduated from University of Illinois and University of California at Berkeley, while he obtained his PhD in political sciences from the University of Southern California. Dr. Baker has held academic appointments in the Pepperdine University in the United States at the University of East Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Baker worked in the Senate Opposition Research Office of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, and later in the Department of Justice Resident Legal Advisor's Office of the U.S. Embassy in Serbia. He's going to present a paper today, Rethinking the European Union's Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, Lessons from California. Right next to him is there is Dr. Monika, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. She works as the Dahrendorf Forum. Previously, she has been an assistant professor at the Willy Brandt Center for German and European Studies at the University of Wrocław, Poland. She has been a visiting fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, at the Centre Canadian d'Études Allemands et Européens at the University of Montreal, and the European Union Center of Excellence at the University in Pittsburgh. She has published widely on European foreign policy, the Eastern Partnership, Europeanization, and policy advising. Dr. Süß will give us a presentation on interlinkages between the European External Action Service and member states in her paper named Inventors and Gatekeepers, the EU member states and the European External Action Service. Next panelist is Dr. Raffaele Marchetti, Assistant Professor in International Relations at LUISS Guido Carli from Italy. He also acts as an external expert for the European Commission and other public and private institutions on issues of governments, public policy, civil society, and peace building. Dr. Marchetti has published widely, both in Italian and English, on global politics and governments, transnational civil society, political risk, and democracy. His paper to be presented today is EU Foreign Policy by Proxy, Engagement with Civil Society. And last but not least, Dr. Anna Isabel Xavier, Assistant Professor in the Political Studies Department in Nova University, Lisbon, in Portugal. And she's also a research fellow in the Portuguese International Relations Institute. Dr. Xavier holds a PhD in International Relations in European Studies from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. She has been a member of the European Commission's Team Europe, developing training activities in European studies, human rights, non-formal education, and citizenship. Her main research areas and publications cover the European Union, security and defense, human security, human rights, and globalization. In 2015, she was awarded the Marshall Memorial Fellowship by the German Marshall Funds of the United States. Today, Dr. Xavier will present a paper, The EU's Security Activeness Towards a New Foreign Policy Strategy. And without any further delay, I would like to give floor to our first panelist of the day. And please stick to 10, 12 minutes, and we'll have a question and answer session later on.
Okay, hi. My name is Rudy Baker. I'm from the University of Surrey in the UK. And it's not a typo. I'm here to talk about the connection between California and what the European Union's emerging foreign policy capacity. It's not a mistake. I'm not joking. What the European Union's emerging foreign policy, specifically focusing on the enlargement and EMP, can learn from California, and really trying to rethink the enlargement and EMP. So start off with some observations. I would argue in the paper that the current enlargement and EMP are providing disappointing results. And I'll try to go through that in a little bit of detail, but not too much, as I have only 10 minutes in a second. I argue that the building up of target countries' institutions through SAAs and AAs is not necessarily providing concrete results. You do have some countries moving forward, but not quite in the direction or at the pace some of us would say is necessary. So here we have a typology of countries covered by the enlargement and EMP, and looking at them from 2005 to 2015. I won't go through all of it in detail. If you're interested, you could go through the paper. But I will pick out one or two countries just to look at. At the outset, let me just point you to a list of excluded countries. The main argument I make in this presentation in the paper that the key to a successful enlargement in EMP is the EU pushing its soft power towards inducing more democratic engagement in the targeted countries, and how to do that and what the California connection is to that I'll talk about in a second. But if that's the focus, certain countries unfortunately have to be excluded. Countries like Belarus and Azerbaijan, where speaking up can get you into a lot of trouble. They're classic authoritarian dictatorships. Azerbaijan from father to son, and apparently these days in Belarus from father to son too, when the little Lukashenko finally grows up. He's just a little boy now, but he's following his dad everywhere, and his dad is very much looking forward apparently to him growing up and taking over. Countries like Morocco and Jordan, which are monarchies, but not classical constitutional monarchies in the British sense, but actual monarchies where the monarch does enjoy some power. Countries like Algeria and Egypt, which are classic Praetorian states, where the military or the deep state has a lot of influence and a lot of power. A country like Lebanon, which at first glance is a classic consociational democracy where the different ethnic groups have to make do, but these days especially is more an Iranian proxy, and arguably up until a few years ago was a Syrian proxy. Libya, Syria, the Palestinian Authority, in the midst of war and violence and civil unrest. Same with Israel, and that's the connection of the Palestinian Authority. Tunisia is making great strides, but again, they're also in the midst of a transition and a lot of violence, a lot of fighting involved there as well. So those countries are excluded. I'll just cherry pick one or two countries out of my list and just talk about the problems of the enlargement and EMP within these countries. Maybe I'll pick one enlargement country and one EMP country. Macedonia is in the news quite a bit these days. As the recent revelations have shown, there's quite a bit of corruption that's gone on in the government. But another problem is the opposition. The opposition themselves, if you look at them historically, if you look at some of the key figures in the opposition, they're also quite compromised. And this is one of the issues, right? Corruption not only in the government, not only in the institutions of the government, but also in the opposition. Let's pick an EMP country. I won't pick Ukraine, that's too easy, but Moldova. Again, classically corrupt state. There was a scandal about a year or two ago. Several $billion disappeared from one of the main banks. One of the oligarchs is involved. The opposition, the current government party, they exchange with one another every few years, the Communist Party and the opposition, now the current government. They're both equally corrupt. Many specialists in Moldovan politics would argue, and Transparency International would certainly agree. So why do we have these problems with the enlargement and EMP, at least according to me anyway? I would argue that entrenched corruption within the institutions of the state, within these countries, and the tendency of such a state of play to affect both governing and opposition parties leads to serious pressures on both the ability of ordinary citizens to contest political power and also participate in the political process itself. This is a problem because one of the very few things we political scientists can agree on is that the classic definition of democracy that we've come to agree on since the 1970s has really two components. And this is the classic ideal definition, right? And it's very hard to find any ideal type of democracy anywhere in the world. But if we're dealing with theoretical models, the ideal democracy has contestation and it has participation. How do we measure things like contestation? Well, there are numerous ways to measure it. I would put to you some ways to measure the right to form political parties, freedom of the press. How do we measure participation? I would put to you some things to look at: a right to vote, fairness of voting procedure, access of parties to finance, extent of suffrage. In the countries that I look at, all of these things exist. You can form parties, you have nascent freedom of the press, you have the right to vote. OSCE goes in every few years and says generally the voting procedure is free and fair, etc. My argument, and my argument why the enlargement in EMP, the results are somewhat problematic when you look at these countries, is because the institutions of the state themselves are compromised, and the opposition themselves as well are compromised. So yes, you can take the EU soft power and look to building up these institutions through putting down exact parameters and goals and SAAs and AAs. But if the institutions themselves are problematic, if they've been hollowed out by the elite, whether they're in the government, whether they're in the opposition, interchanging every few years, the results will be less than ideal, I would put to you. What's the solution then, if you buy my point, assuming you buy my point? If the very institutions of the state are corrupted, in that instance, the challenge becomes not how to build up the institutions of the state, I would put to you, but rather how to bypass them altogether. And this is where California comes in. And I'm a proud Californian, by the way, just to put that out there. So what's the California case? Let me talk a little bit about the California case. So California became a state in 1850. And starting from about the 1860s, the Central Pacific Railroad, this was the area of industrialization in the US, the area of mechanization, the era of railroads. This is before we had cars. The United States is a big country, and suddenly we had these things called railroads. And they were really binding the country together. And it was especially important from California because before the railroads came along, it would take you months to get from New York to California, because this was before the Panama Canal. Travel all the way down the isthmus, all the way past Chile and the South Arctic, to go all the way back up to California. So when the railroads come along, this is a big deal, especially for California. There was a problem, however. The Central Pacific Railway assumed a dominant position in the state's politics from the 1860s onwards. And by dominant, I mean they were basically running the state. They would buy and sell politicians. They would push forward the legislation they wanted that was favorable to them through the politicians they bought and sold, and they built a monopoly of political and economic power in the state. And if you cross the Central Pacific Railroad, whether as an ordinary citizen or as another corporation, they would destroy you because they had been able to establish through this corruption a monopoly of political and economic power in the state. There's a reform movement in California. In 1878, they wanted to try to put an end to this. A new state constitution was the result in 1879. And it had some interesting things in there, like putting in a railroad commission, trying to build up institutions to make them resistant to corruption, kind of similar to what the ENP and the enlargement tried to do. What was the result? The Central Pacific Railroad just bought the new set of politicians that came in into these commissions that were designed to control them. So by the turn of the 20th century, the situation was no better. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was worse. Progressive era, an era in American history, when there was a lot of movement towards reform from the 1890s to 1920s. In California itself, this manifested in a new push to reform the state and end the influence of the railroads. How did the progressives do it? Specifically, Hiram Johnson, who was elected progressive governor of California in 1910, and the people around him that were elected in the legislature on the progressive ticket. On both the Democratic and both the Republican parties, which were the two main parties, the progressive movement infiltrated both parties. How did they do it? They passed a series of amendments to the 1879 Constitution, and that's the state constitution we still have today, that enshrined direct democracy as a permanent feature in California politics. And this was designed in mind, specifically, this is very clear, this was no open secret, to destroy the power of the Central Pacific in the state. And we still have it today. How does it work? In California, if I'm a citizen and I think there should be legislation on whatever, I can lobby my representative or senator in the state legislature, or I can go collect signatures from 5% of the registered voters, and we can make legislation through an initiative. If I can collect 5% of the signatures, the Secretary of State, who's an elected official, will certify that, and in the next election, this initiative will be put to the people, so the people can actually legislate. Not only can the people legislate, the people can amend the state constitution. The procedure is the same, but you need 8% of the signatures of the registered voters. And as a proud Californian who always votes, it's always fun to vote in California elections because all these different legislatory statutes that you can vote by through initiative and even constitutional amendments. Not only can legislation passed through initiative not be subsequently amended by the legislature, this is very important, of course, but legislation passed by the legislature itself can be amended or overturned entirely through initiative. I'm almost done. So what are my key policy suggestions on what the EU can learn from the California case? I would suggest that the main goal of the enlargement in EMP should be to look at the founding pillars of democracy, which are citizen contestation and participation, and look to restore them and revitalize them. Because if you don't, and albeit these are two extreme examples that I'm picking on purpose, but if you don't, you get what you saw in Ukraine in 2014 and also in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2014. The people will rise up. That's not good for anybody, you know, violent revolution, whether it's successful or not. The California case represents an ideal blueprint, I would argue, for the EU to reorientate its considerable soft power to an approach that might bear considerable more fruit than the current strategy is bearing today. California case shows that corrupt institutions are sometimes part of the problem, corrupt political institutions, and cannot be sufficiently reformed from within. The silver bullet, then, is bypassing these institutions altogether. Direct democracy represented a pathway for the citizens of California and the progressive reformers to reorientate political power downwards, to bring power back to the people. I would argue that the EU doesn't need to abandon its current enlargement and EMP strategy altogether, but rather it, I would respectfully argue, should augment it with a clear policy recommendation to the targeted countries in the enlargement and EMP, maybe through SAAs and AAs, that they begin to institute mechanisms for direct democracy in their political systems. And that can possibly end up being a way forward. Thank you.
Dr. Monika, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have my watch here, so I'll try to be brief and to arrange this somehow to speak within 10 minutes or 12. But forgive me if I speak a little bit longer. I will do my best. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for organizing such a wonderful event and to have the possibility to discuss the EU foreign policy. I would skip the question mark at the end of the title, but I think we can agree on this here. I am going to present to you a paper which is actually work in progress. Therefore, I'm very much looking forward to your comments. within this forum here or also within the following days. And I'm also very much looking forward to the book presentation today afternoon. I'm sure it will help me somehow to develop further with the project. The title of my presentation is Inventors and Gatekeepers, the EU Member States and the European External Action Service. So as you can see, I focused in my paper on the latest changes within the EU foreign policy framework, the establishment of the European External Action Service, and the transformation somehow of the High Representative on Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. There is an underlying assumption, and you already referred to that we have now a hardware. So in terms of capabilities of the European Union, in terms of the level of institutionalization, we are equipped to perform at the international stage, but for some reasons we don't really do. And the paper I wrote should go beyond the question who is guilty, about the blame game, who is guilty that the EU doesn't perform as it should at the international stage. And I look at the specific relationship between the member states as the key stakeholders in the European foreign policy and the External Action Service they established some years ago. I argue that we deal with a paradox. On one hand, there is a functional pressure. The member states have to act together simply to tackle the challenges they are facing. There are several examples to be made here. We have troubles in the neighborhood, in the south, in the east. We have Syria, we have Islamic State, and we all know that the single member state, even Great Britain, United Kingdom, or Germany, or France, they simply cannot deal with these problems by themselves. And the smaller member states of the EU even less, of course. So they simply have to act together, and they have to form a common position towards the problems. There is a strong public support towards developing of the stronger EU foreign policy. The latest polls show that over 66% of the EU citizens are in favor for the strengthening of the EU foreign policy. And we have decisions taken in the negotiations of the Treaty of Lisbon. We can go back, of course, with the decisions to the Convention for the Future of Europe, so the establishment of the External Action Service and the new role of the High Representative. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, we still have little willingness of the member states to share their competences with the newcomers, as I call it in the paper, and we observe a situation where the member states are rather as gatekeepers and not facilitators of the new framework. And there is a puzzle I intend to investigate in the paper, how the relationships between the member states and the EES look like. And I look at patterns and dynamics of cooperation and attitudes towards the External Action Service in chosen member states. We will go to this in a second. Why should we care? Maybe this is also an important question. Why should we care about the member states and the relationship with the External Action Service? I won't elaborate on that longer because you have it in the paper. But of course, the member states are still the main stakeholders, as I said, of the EU foreign policy, and they were crucial in terms of the agency while the External Action Service was established. So simply, the member states are the key to the role of the External Action Service, and there is, of course, a very strong mutual interdependency now between the member states and the External Action Service. The supranational logic in the foreign policy after the financial crisis has even weakened, and we have a strong intergovernmental move within the policy field again. So therefore, I think, and I argue in the paper, we should care how the relationship look like. Coming to the research framework, I concentrated on 3 countries, Germany, Poland, and Great Britain. They are all ambitious in terms of foreign policy objectives. They have heavy-duty objectives to influence EU foreign policy. Obviously, the aspirations, scope, and also capabilities of the German diplomacy and UK diplomacy are much bigger than the Polish one, but Poland is an important player in terms of the region, in terms of Eastern Europe, and this is also, I think, without serious doubt, the most important player in terms of the new member states who joined the EU 2004, most important in the meaning, most ambitious in terms of influencing EU foreign policy. They have all the three countries, on the other hand, very different attitudes to the European Union and to the European integration. And I also intended to check in the paper, or to prove in the paper, how do the different attitudes to European integration maybe influence the attitude towards the External Action Service. In terms of the framework, the relationship between member states and the EES, I concentrate on 4 points of references: the general attitudes towards the new kid on the block, patterns of cooperation and potential functions the country or the countries are willing to pass to the EES, channels of communication, which is an important issue basically also in the new member states, and obstacles and limitations in the mutual relation. And there is a small remark to be made here. We have it elaborated more in the paper. Due to the size of the paper, I focus only on the relationship between the foreign ministries of the countries and the headquarters in Brussels. I do not focus on the relationship between the embassies and the delegations, which is of course a very important issue, but this is not the subject of the paper. Are we so far? No, we have still time. Okay, I will come to conclusions maybe then. So we have 3 countries, and I focus on 3 main points in each country. Germany sees itself as a strong supporter of the External Action Service. This is what I learned in the interviews in the German Foreign Office. And I also had the impression that they use the External Action Service as a channel to influence, to somehow enhance the legitimization of the German foreign policy and to enhance the representation of German interest at the European stage. Germany seems to be open to discuss the qualified majority voting in terms of common foreign and security policy, and there are still very clear limitations in the role of the External Action Service. A good example is the case of Ukraine, as we all saw. Angela Merkel, not only she, but she basically downplayed the European institutions during the crisis and took over dealing with Russia and Ukraine during the latest crisis in the East. Poland uses External Action Service to multiply its power. To gain an added value to its diplomacy. Polish diplomats are open to discuss the common embassies and consular services, which is not the case in terms of Germany or United Kingdom. And still the main question for Poland is the underrepresentation of Poles at the highest level of not only of the External Action Service, but also of the European Commission. Great Britain, cooperation seems to be possible only within a very few fields due to the size of the British diplomatic service, of course. There is no will to further extend the competence portfolio of the External Action Service, and we have, of course, the whole wave of Euroscepticism, which influence, as I argue in the paper, very much the attitudes to the External Action Service. Very quickly, the main conclusions. We have extremely diverse patterns of cooperation. That's what I proved in the paper, and therefore it's worth to include more countries, also smaller countries of the European Union, to this study. We deal with a vicious circle somehow. So member states expect the External Action Service to perform and to prove the added value, and then they are going to willing to give more competences. This is basically what I heard several times. And also some officials told me about their impression and their take on the EU global strategy as a possible turning point in the relationship between the External Action Service and the member states, since the position of Mogherini and of the External Action Service seems to be very unique in terms of drafting the new strategy. And some of them admitted it may be the point where the member states will notice the added value of the External Action Service. Very shortly, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seuss. It was very interesting, very thoughtful presentation, and we are very much on a schedule, so we have much of time. And with these remarks, I'd like to invite next panelists to speak. Please, Raffaele, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizer for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here and share my ideas with you. My paper is about a special side of foreign policy. The title is Foreign Policy by Proxy. This is part of the wider liberal internationalist attitude today in global politics. It is a less discussed dimension of EU foreign policy, especially inside the EU. Not so much attention is paid to that, but outside the EU, this is an increasingly controversial issues. And more in general, it's an increasingly important component of global politics. Yes, indeed, a post-Westphalian global politics. There are opportunities and risks here. This kind of policy can easily backfire. So I think we need to pause for a moment, wait for a moment, and consider this carefully and assess it properly. In global governance today, the relation between public institutions and private actors, it's very important. From NGOs to business organization, public-private partnership, multi-stakeholder initiative, this is part and parcel of today's global politics. Ideas, people, money, political support, weapon, they all cross borders independently, but often with the help of foreign actors. We are in a transition period, but we don't have clear guidelines for this. Think about Ukraine, Syria, Hong Kong. Whole cases in which foreign influence is denounced to be the sort of instability. All major actors practice this, and all major actors denounce it. Think about these cases. Russia shutting down USAID office in Moscow, but at the same time providing funding to populist movements inside the EU. China accusing foreign actors of fomenting revolt in Hong Kong, in Tibet, in Uyghur region, but then funding Confucius Institutes and other kinds of activities abroad. In the USA, the harsh debate about foreign funding of major think tanks, including a Brookings institution, the Atlantic Council, and others. And many American sort of policymakers worried about foreign influence, infiltration through think tanks in the USA. But at the same time, USA funding through the National Endowment for Democracy many NGOs and civil society actors abroad. Or indeed the EU. All the debates about shutting down mosques in the EU, but at the same time the EU providing funding for the European Democracy for Human Rights. The European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, or indirectly the European Endowment for Democracy. I mean, there is a clear pattern of public institution engagement with and through civil society organization in order to promote specific foreign policy objectives. And this is this is the center of my presentation. I mean, I just assume in the paper I spent more time, the overall EU outward impetus. There are interest-based reasons, normative reasons, institutional reasons for considering and for observing the push toward foreign projection of the EU. In these, I follow those many scholars that interpret the EU as a kind of sui generis empire. Edgar Grande, Ulrich Beck, Zelonka, Chandler, many people who would argue that the EU has this intrinsic logic toward external projection for a number of reasons. Of course, it's not the classical idea of the empire we have. It's a more cosmopolitan empire characterized by integration and asymmetry, in which, of course, the more you get integrated by renouncing to part of your sovereign prerogatives, the more you are endowed with a status of power. And on the contrary, the more one is far from the center and therefore formally sovereign, the less one remains sovereign inside the European sort of sphere of action. Now, there is this kind of impetus, how it is pursued, how it is carried out. Well, part of the story has to do with civil society, and civil society is an important component anyway of EU governance, inside and outside. Civil society is usually understood in a functional way, as a kind of partner in output-oriented sort of approach to policymakers. Civil societies are there to provide support to EU policies, both inside and outside. There is a long story of sort of the increasing participation of civil society inside the EU governance. Of course, the Maastricht Treaty in 1993 was an important turning point, the end of the kind of elite-driven permissive consensus, and the beginning for search for external legitimacy. And this was searched through the engagement with civil society and through the empowerment of the European Parliament. So beginning was the idea of consultation with social partners. Then in the 80s and 90s, partnership. Today we talk about partnership, participation of civil society. It is clear that civil society plays an important role, and by civil society I intend a large number of actors usually engage in the so-called comitology within the EU. Okay, this is inside. But of course also outside in foreign policy, civil society do play an important role. In principle, civil society organizations are assumed to be carrier of virtue. They are expected not to have vested interest and to be able to promote reform more effectively and cheaply, less expensively than other actors. They are kind of trust generators. That's the kind of general assumption. It's a kind of generator of social capital. How? Well, the EU does this in two ways, basically indirectly and directly. Indirectly by altering the structure within civil society, within which civil society organizations operate in other countries, in third countries. And this is done by sort of pushing for reform and opening up of channels of communication and interaction between foreign governments and foreign civil society organizations in that context. For instance, in the European neighborhood policy and the Eastern Partnership, this is very clear. There is always one part of the sort of EU approach that is looking at sort of opening up avenues and opportunities for civil society organizations to enter into the policy making process. But also directly, the EU engages with civil society, first through dialogue, second through training, and third, of course, by providing financial support. The European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights is there precisely for this. This is a kind of transformational diplomacy. The idea is to transform significantly the kind of political regime that is in place in many countries by soft issues like gender equality, indigenous people, to more substantial issues, constitutional provision for oversight of the military and land reform and electoral systems. These are very important sort of changes that are promoted through the engagement with civil society in third countries. Of course, this raises important issues. There are internal problems that has to do with the fact that sometimes EU is not really able to select the right partners in third countries. Sometimes it generates a kind of depoliticization of civil society organizations. At the end of the day, very technical sort of professional NGOs are really important in the EU programs without sort of the EU being able to engage with the socially and politically relevant civil society organizations. But at the same time, on the opposite, there is also sometimes an excessive politicization according to which civil society engaging with the EU then create a kind of split between those that work with the EU and then the other organizations that are not working for that, perhaps more rooted, more in a way substantial from a social point of view, and this split becomes significant. But there are also external controversies. And of course, this kind of public diplomacy initiative or track 2, track 3 diplomacy enter into direct tension with sovereignty. We should be very clear about this. This kind of sort of supranational sort of attitude, transnational sort of pressure that a number of countries, not only the EU, I mean, the same is done by the USA, the same is done by many other Western countries, Japan, Australia, Japan, and others. This is, it is supposed, in principle, just to bypass the consent of the government, because the idea is that sometimes through the government it's impossible to promote reforms, then you bypass it and you enter into contact with local citizens and you promote reform from below. This is very common, but it is, of course, from a liberal perspective, conceptualized as positive because it increases the possibility of exercising freedom of choice by the individuals. But at the same time, from a kind of realpolitik position, this is considered an attempt to impose foreign influence on national affairs. Currently, we are witnessing a global backlash against foreign-funded NGOs. There are 47 states that are imposing sanctions on foreign-funded civil society organizations. This means that the majority of the countries that receive foreign funding NGOs working in their countries are reacting by imposing limitations, censorship, or just kicking out NGOs from their countries. 3 examples. Russia in 2012 passing a legislation against the so-called NGOs categorized as foreign agent. Ethiopia, in which if you are a foreign-funded NGOs and you work on human rights and democracy, you cannot receive more than 10% of your budget. Otherwise, you are not eligible to work in Ethiopia. Or Bolivia shutting down USAID office in 2013. Now, these are just few examples, but in a way suggest, on the one hand, a clear trend. More and more countries, I'm talking about here Western democratic countries, but as I said, the same is done more and more also by non-Western countries. Think about Syria. I mean, obviously there are a plethora of transnational influences, foreign countries providing support, ideas, money, and weapons on the one side, and on the other side, I mean, this is part of the game today. I mean, today's global politics is not government to government only. It is very often government through non-governmental actors, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal, but that's influencing domestic politics. So we should first recognize that this is an important component of today's international affairs, and we should also recognize that there are opportunities but also risks into that. Not only risks in terms of the contestation that this Western sort of attitude is generating, but also risk in terms of other countries influencing the West. I mean, I mentioned the cases of the US debate about foreign funded think tanks, or the case in Europe about the Islamic presence through mosques. So I think that's an important part of global politics. I think it's important that we spend time thinking about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raffaele. And please, with this, I invite our last but not least panelist, Dr. Anna Isabel Xavier. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to express my honor and gratitude to participate for the first time in the Belgrade Security Forum. My presentation is entitled The EU's Security Actorness Towards a New Foreign Policy. To start my presentation, I hope to be brief and as disciplined as my colleagues. I would like to recall the conclusions of the last European Council meeting of June 25-26 of this year. And we can read that the High Representative will continue the process of strategic reflection with a view to preparing an EU global strategy on foreign and security policy in close cooperation with member states to be submitted to the European Council by June 2016. The upcoming strategic review seems therefore highly expected by member states and European institutions to tackle the post-Lisbon Treaty challenges and address current security environment. Well, recalling the foreign policy provisions from Maastricht to Lisbon and the attempt of designing the first strategic concept in 2003, this presentation aims to contribute to a wider discussion on the need for a new commitment among the member states to assess how the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty, namely in what concerns the common security and defense policy, might be helpful to address EU's changing security environment. Assuming that EU's foreign policy is still in process, which I label in the paper as security actorness, we will conclude that more important than a new strategy, EU member states must focus in delivering concrete results and gather effort in a truly common European agenda on security and defense to foster EU's foreign policy in the neighborhood and around the world. This presentation will also illustrate the need to identify concrete policy and action-oriented priorities in the new strategic review, followed by a white book of defense to assure the implementation in practice of the general guidelines that are expected to be approved in June 2016. I won't get into detail in my paper, but I would like to share with you my basic guideline of the manuscript. I divided my manuscript in 3 parts. Part 1 aims to recall how the EU's foreign policy was designed from the Maastricht to the Lisbon Treaty, from the common foreign and security policy to the common security and defense policy. And this brief chronology would allow us to portray the EU as a security player, referring to the main conclusions of the European Councils and the development of several political, economic, civilian, and military soft power mechanisms, as well as peacebuilding and crisis management instruments. Those elements have been progressively incorporated in EU's foreign policy, aiming to turn a sui generis player into a security provider in the international arena in the post-Cold War. We will understand how the 1998 San Malo Summit, the Helsinki European Council in 1999, and the Santa Maria da Feiras European Council in 2000 represent important milestones in the strengthening of the second pillar, broadening the scope of the Petersburg tasks and empowering the EU with the ability to assume its international security responsibilities. Part 2 would focus in the strategic narrative, questioning in what extent the 2003 European Security Strategy, the 2008 report, as well as the 2004 Barcelona and 2007 Madrid reports may be perceived as the first attempts to develop a strategic culture in the field of security and defense. We will suggest the erosion of the distinction of old and new threats and analyze what changed in the security environment from 2003 to 2016 to justify a strategic review as soon as expected. This part is firmly connected with part 3, as we attempt both a definition of what a strategic document should be, but also prospect what elements the next strategic review should consider. And it is in this third part that I'm going to focus now in the next moments. What can we expect from the upcoming strategic review, especially if we have in consideration Mogherini's assessment of the current global environment in the document The European Union in a Changing Global Environment, a More Connected, Contested and Complex World, that she presented to Donald Tusk early this year. Does the EU need a new strategic review in 2016? Well, comparing with 2003 security environment, I think that we could argue that the overall objective, the challenges and the strategic objectives are not outdated yet. But still, faced with the hybrid warfare from Russia and the Daesh transnational threat, the EU needs to be more effective, more preventive, and more resilient. The security landscape of the EU, as well as of NATO and the neighborhood, the values, the goals, and the threats are not exactly new, but they are undoubtedly more challenging. The dramatic refugee crisis that the EU is facing in the recent weeks has been urging for the EU's role as a crisis management global actor, normative settler, and security provider. But still, it seems that there are no political will to go deeper on the transference of security and defense competencies to the European realm, when member states are too focused in the economic crisis or the refugees sharing. What can be the prospects for 2016 and way ahead? Well, I think it's worth to note that a strategic review is by nature a guidelines prospect. Therefore, it's not only desirable that member states are deeply involved in its design, but especially that it's action-oriented. It's also important to say that a strategic concept is a formal document that defines the strategic guidelines and more relevant answers towards the security environment in order to support decision-making and the framework planning. aims to list the priorities for security and defense in accordance with national and international interests. There is no standard format or structure, but we could argue that it is expected to include some of the following items. The definition of the ethos, the EU's distinctive identity. The definition of the conceptual pillars, the values, the principles, the interests. The identification of international and regional challenges, balance of power, threats and risks to international and national security. Identification of cooperative security alliances and partnerships. Identification of areas of geopolitical interests and regional and global geostrategic relevance. Identification of both vulnerabilities and strategic assets. Identification of permanent and cyclical objectives, and a clarification on the implementation and review guidelines. For the upcoming strategic review, it is therefore important to address all these questions and find a common ground for member states' ambitions in specific axes. First, on values, principles, and interests. The trendy word of the next strategic review seems to be hybrid. But a definition of hybrid warfare is needed, especially when there is a structural division among the South and the Eastern countries on the assumption and visibility of the Russian threat. Moreover, Southern countries, especially after the migrant crisis that Europe is facing, are more concerned with the southern flank of the EU and the threats coming from the Mediterranean, piracy, terrorism, crime. Second, capabilities. It will be important to discuss both strengths and vulnerabilities, the deployment of military and civilian capabilities, namely EU's battle groups, as well as the defense spending of member states, GDP benchmarks, Athena mechanism, in an attempt to challenge the supposed declining relevance of the EU as a security provider. Third, partnerships. A multilateralism narrative, as in 2003, is not enough. Multilateralism is a guideline towards NATO, United Nations, and regional organizations, but concrete actions are needed. Who are the strategic partners of the EU, and how can the EU help them to be stable? More money or more democracy? This tension is not solved yet, as the Arab Spring showed us. Fourth, the question of the ethos, that is the distinctive identity of the EU, the beginning and the aim of all things. The academic literature has been illustrating how the political dimension of European integration has not evolved to the extent of the role that the EU can and must play. If an economic power without having to make any kind of new alignment or create new devices, if a civilian power that requires an adaptation of the existing devices in one single pillar, or if a power in which the community and intergovernmental devices must be secure together with the development of credible and effective military capabilities. In this context, I believe it's worth to note Rethinking and Vogler's argument that EU's actorness may be achieved by three elements: opportunity to act in the world, presence, ability to move and be effective outside its borders, influencing the development of other states, and capacity to seize every opportunity to be present. Also, Caparazzo and Jupil suggest four requirements for the EU to be a global player: recognition, authority, autonomy, and cohesion. But I think, and I'm almost concluding, I think we should indeed question if the multiple opportunities are enough to project the current EU's external role to a strategic power with effective presence as well as capacity to meet expectation. If the EU wants to play a role as a strategic player in the global chess, a long way remains to be done to avoid two-weight, two-measure judgments and thus control dissenting voices that weaken the internal and external political cohesion of the EU. Most of the recent cases show us, in fact, that the EU has golden opportunities to stand in front of international affairs. Russia and Ukraine, migration crisis, has the capacity to be present but cannot fulfill the never-ending challenge. The EU in action shows a lack of support and convergence between member states, as well as a huge dilemma and a structural gap between the capabilities and expectations, between security needs and the general inadequacy of tools and resources available. In brief, Through trade, human rights, democracy, or peacekeeping mission, the EU has been able to explore opportunities to project its presence worldwide. Often, if not exclusively, this process is expressed by soft power through the use of instruments such as European neighbourhood policy or political and economic encouragements. For 2016, it is expected a new global EU foreign policy strategy, but also a renewed European neighbourhood policy. In 2015, the European Commission presented a European agenda on migration and a European agenda on security, 2015-2020, to support better cooperation between member states in the fight against terrorism, organized crime, and cybercrime. It seems clear that the EU has several instruments and strategy to tackle today's challenges, turning the threats into opportunities. However, it will not succeed if all these documents are gathered in a single strategic culture and be able to prevent and anticipate, create the framework needed for member states to act shortly once the events occur. If not, the EU won't need a foreign policy because the EU will be a regional bloc with no global expression or influence whatsoever. So, does the EU need a foreign policy? Since the end of the Cold War, it has been clear that the EU not only needs a foreign policy, but needs to be able to anticipate and prevent if it wants to be a global player. To conclude, the EU has gradually been developing instruments, sustainable and credible capacity to be recognized as a security actor in international relations and a real security and defense community. Almost 30 ESDP missions all over the world are a proof of this statement. But if it aims to be recognized as a security provider within its borders and beyond its neighborhood, the Lisbon Treaty most difficult task is yet to be signed. Give the EU the capacity to be a more capable and more active security provider. If the EU wants to act as a strategic player at the global level, a long way has to be pursued in order to avoid double standards, dissenting voices that question the EU's cohesion both internally and externally. The EU doesn't frequently seems to practice what it preaches, remaining systemic contradictions between theory and practice, tensions between the global and the regional powers, difficulties on the formulation of policies and objectives, lack of political will, and no sign of a long-term perspective. The lack of a strategy, in sum, it lacks a strategy that ironically exists in food for thought paper, but not in action. So the upcoming strategic review challenge is thus clear. Put words into practice and engage member states to agree in a truly common foreign policy. Several questions will surely remain open to discussion in the next months that will hopefully commit and open the floor to a robust strategic review follow-up process in order to increase the effectiveness, the visibility, and the impact of the EU's security actorness. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xavier. And this was our last panelist of our first panel of today. And now I'd like to give floor to our discussant, Dr. Jozef Bátora. What is yours?
Is there a microphone? Okay, well, no. All right. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in Belgrade. Dobar dan. We in Bratislava have been following the Belgrade Security Forum because we tend to think that GlobSec in Bratislava is the primary forum on security. But we have something to learn, also thanks to Filip Ejduš, who's been organizing this academic event at the Belgrade Security Forum. So indeed, in Belgrade, we do have a new challenger coming up in Central Europe, because we do think Belgrade is Central Europe. This is a Masarykian version of thinking about Central Europe. And we also think that Kosovo is part of Central Europe, by the way. These were very interesting papers, and there's an underlying theme that has been going through these papers. And that is, all of these papers basically speak to the question, what should the EU do in defining its new security strategy? There are various aspects that were addressed by the speakers. And the role of a discussant is to go through these and sort of get back to them and push back at them at certain points and ask them questions, raise critical issues. Roozbeh's paper, there are two issues which I think, and it's an interesting comparison for someone who likes California. I was really excited to read your paper. Now, there are two crucial problems with the issue here of comparing the situation of fighting corruption in California and using similar strategies in the EU's neighborhood. The first problem is that the EU is not a state, and the United States was a state at the time when California was becoming part of it and when they have been trying to establish institutions to establish democratic governance in California. So fighting corruption and pushing back at the railway corporation, controlling the state, monopolizing the state, is something which was enabled by the fact that there was indeed a state monopoly of power, an enforceable state monopoly of power in California. Now, of course, the question is, what can the EU do in the neighborhood where it doesn't have the monopoly of power and enforce these kinds of reforms? Because it doesn't. So the exciting thing about the EU, of course, is that it's not a state, and several of these presentations spoke to that fact. And I think there are also a lot of advantages, but I'll come back to that. But this is a challenge here with that comparison. The second challenge here with the solution that you're proposing, that is installing direct democracy as a way of bypassing corrupt institutions, this could turn out, of course, to be an opportunity. And I'm sure a lot of populations in the neighboring countries who have been disenchanted by some of the reforms would be happy to do that, go forward with such solutions. But there are a lot of dangers involved in such installing of direct democracy. Think about the current refugee crisis, and why shouldn't I quote a situation in my own country, which is an EU member state, Slovakia. There was a referendum in Gabčíkovo, which is a small village in the south of Slovakia, where there was going to be set up a refugee camp. And of course, the locals voted overwhelmingly against setting that up. Luckily, we do have a president in our country, Mr. Kiska, who made it very clear that these kinds of fears, which were by and large quite irrational, were exactly what I just said, irrational. And these solutions are being implemented. So I think what seems to be a solution that these countries in the neighborhood need are stable institutions, if you can achieve that, and enlightened democratic leadership, if you can achieve that, if you can have that. And I think that's where the EU should be working and working in support of. Monika Su's very interesting question that you raised and the paradox that you raised between the rhetorical support of the member states for the EAS and, of course, the practical incapability or unwillingness to support the EAS in its work. Now, I think that has to do simply with the fact that there is a struggle for symbolic power between the member states' diplomatic services and the EAS. This is something which a number of scholars have been working on. Rebecca Adler-Nissen has written extensively about this, but also our book, which we will be presenting this afternoon, speaks to that struggle. So interestingly enough, because of course diplomacy is the state prerogative in foreign policy, this is what marks state sovereignty. So as soon as the EU will be gaining more sovereignty in the sense of gaining diplomatic capabilities, if we can call it the EAS, but if it ends up being a diplomatic service, fully fledged diplomatic service in the sense of a foreign ministry, that moment that happens, the member states lose their sovereignty in the sense of promoting their own diplomatic interests. It's as simple as that. But this is a tough struggle. So in fact, the main opposition to the EAS is not coming from the outside, from the United States or Moscow or Tokyo. They would be just as happy to speak to anyone in Brussels if they can have an effective and efficient counterpart. The main opposition to the EAS and its role is actually coming from the robust institutions of diplomacy in the member states. Now, that said, I think what the what the point should be for the EEAS in the development of its strategy would, of course, be to say that they do not do what classical diplomatic services and foreign ministries do. They do something else. They do something different. They're the service which is a hybrid, comprehensive service, which is different than classical foreign services. This is actually, from an institutional and organizational point of view, a survival strategy for the EEAS. If it doesn't, it ends up being a travel agency for the European Union institutions. Now, I'll get back to this point a little later when I talk about Anna's paper, but Raffaele. Now, of course, the role of the civil society has been an important element in the promotion of European Union interests, just as it has been, as you pointed out, in the promotion of interests of other actors in world politics. Now, I think what your presentation makes very clear is that we do not actually know what member states do around the world in terms of their civil society activities. It would be very helpful, and I think this could be a project for you and others to work on, to try and work out and map out what exactly do the member states do. Because in fact, the European Union and its member states are extremely influential in terms of cultural diplomacy. They are extremely attractive societies. Culturally, the cultural goods produced by Europe, arguably, are indeed the most pervasive source of influence of Europe in the world, and have been for the last several centuries. So, but do we really know what the member states do? That's one question, mapping it out. And the second question, of course, would be, it is not a given that the taxpayers in the member states are actually there to support activities which would be European instead of their own national. If you look at the strategies of cultural institutes such as the Swedish Institute or Alliance Française, they all promote national culture, right? And I think it makes a lot of sense that they do, because this is who pays them. I mean, these are the taxpayers of Sweden, taxpayers of France. So if the EU is going to promote its own culture, if there is such a thing, it needs to be thought about. How do we share in such an endeavor? How do we work this out? Now, Anna's paper, I think there is a very clear, it is very clear that the EU needs to deliver and needs to think about the new strategy. Now, the question for the EU in working out its strategy, I think right now, is that strategy should define what the EU can do differently and better than the member states. Because indeed, it shouldn't really be replacing the member states. I think Catherine Ashton, in her first review of the EEAS in 2013, actually said that, that the EEAS is not there to replace the member states' foreign ministries, it's there to complement them. And yet, the EEAS, and we make that very clear in that book that we are going to present this afternoon with David Spence, the EEAS is an interstitial organization, an organization crossing different fields and combining resources. It's not a foreign service. It's combining resources of the Defense Ministry, of crisis management operations, but also of the Developmental Agency. It's a Trade Commissioner service. It is a comprehensive kind of an agency. And mind you, there is no government in the world which would have that, no international organization which would have that. So instead of being an insufficient and incapable foreign service, this could in fact be the new model of a foreign affairs administration, foreign policy administration, global affairs administration, a trailblazer of a new model. But that needs to be conceptualized, thought about, and I think these kinds of thinking are there to help us along the way. So last point, I think we shouldn't be too worried about these different definitions of security challenges stemming from the east of Europe, that is hybrid warfare, Russia-supported separatists, and in Ukraine, and the southern flank of the EU, as you called it, Anna, piracy and crime. Because indeed, these are similar kinds of challenges to the sovereignty of the state, and these are complex causes of the fragility of societies. Now, of course, addressing these complex causes, this is something which, where the EU is in fact perfectly positioned to combine all these resources that are there, and organizationally the EAS is there to do exactly that. As long as we realize that they can, and if they realize that they can. All right, that's all I had to say for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bátora. Now, before we open the floor for questions, do we have a microphone in the audience? We have, right? But I would like to use my privilege being a moderator and ask the first question. So just to remind, when you stand up, please, when you take a microphone and ask a question, please stand up, please introduce who you are, then ask a question. I'll try to take 1 to maybe 3 questions at once, and then panelists as well as our keynote speaker. I'd like to remind that our keynote speaker as well can and should be asked questions. And using my privilege, I'd like to ask the first question to our keynote speaker. He was speaking about, at least he touched upon at some point about this qualified majority voting and this case that we have the migration recently in European Union. Would you think if qualified majority voting in CFSP area, which is right now all the decisions have to be accepted unanimously by all 28 member states, but if it is changed at some point, would it lead to the next point of European integration, or it would be much more like a step towards the end of the European Union? And asking this question, yes, maybe you can ask, respond to this, but before that, I'd like to ask the audience, do they have any questions, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Rethieu from London School of Economics. I have a question for Rudy Baker. Working on the EMP myself, it's very refreshing to see some new ideas and new proposals, but I would take a bit of a critical approach to them. The first question is, how would you enforce all of your proposals? How would the European Commission go about doing that? And a second, more cheeky question relates to the biggest criticism that the neighbors posed in relation to the EMP, that of the EMP being asymmetrical, the European Union mostly transferring norms and not taking anything into account in terms of what the neighbors want. So some states like Azerbaijan or Armenia would say, well, you imposed on us European norms, now you're coming with Californian norms, so why should we do that? Well, I'm curious to see your replies to this. Thanks.
I wasn't aware direct democracy was a Californian norm, but as a Californian, I guess I'll take it. In regards to the first question, how would you enforce this? Sorry if it came off this way. It's not a question about enforcing anything. It's an issue of enforcement. I mean, foreign policy, whichever state we're talking about, even the hegemon these days, the United States, it's not about enforcing anything. It's about encouragement. So the European Union, through its foreign policy mechanisms, through the enlargement in EMP, through SAAs and A's, they encourage states to behave in certain ways, and there are carrots and there are sticks. My argument is this can be another policy objective that they can pursue. Now, we can have disagreements whether this is good or this is bad, but it's not about enforcement, it's about encouragement. If I could also just quickly, since I have the floor, just quickly respond to the really good critiques brought forth by our discussant, Dr. Bátora. EU is not a state, of course. It's who knows what it will be one day. Although where I live right now, they're not a fan of that idea. But anyway, it's a transnational actor. But what happened in California in 1911 had nothing to do with the federal government. It was a California initiative. Federal government didn't care one way or the other. And it's hard for us to think of this these days if we're interested in the United States and we're experts in the United States. But federalism 100 years ago in the United States was very different than what federalism is in the United States today, since the 1930s and the New Deal era regulations and reforms. The United States as a federal country was a much weaker federal country 100 years ago. So the federal government had nothing to do with what happened in California in 1911 one way or the other. Quite frankly, what the Central Pacific was doing, it was really limited to California and a little bit in Nevada, so the federal government didn't care one way or the other. What the role of the EU could be, though, is to spur possibly a movement towards reform and looking at direct democracy as an option. There are a variety of factors that gave rise to the progressive movement in the US in this period that I talk about, which didn't go into in the presentation, no need to. But my argument is that could possibly be the EU's role through its considerable soft power. And as for dangers in direct democracy, believe me, we in California are well aware of the dangers of direct democracy. A lot of us these days are talking about the need for a third constitution. Why be satisfied with two? Let's together and come up with a third. But an argument I make in the paper is it might be time for a third constitution in California because we have 21st century problems now. But with respect, I say these problems that we're facing in a lot of the enlargement in EMP countries are 19th century problems. It's unfortunate you still have these 19th century problems, but they're there. And perhaps we look at some 19th, 20th century solutions that seem to work in California. But
Thank you. Would you like to respond? Is there a microphone, please?
Thank you very much. The question about QMV, and I take it that the question is, will QMV make the CFSP? I'm not sure. There was a quote a year ago or so in The Economist where they just stated that European power has disappeared down the rabbit hole of European integration. And that's sort of the beauty of European integration, is that it tends to diffuse power and hide it away. And for the EU to become an effective foreign policy actor, in the words of Anna Isabel, the EU would really need to change its pace and also get some program updates. I think that might lead to a huge amount of conflict in the EU, given the rather different foreign policy traditions of the member states. And you see now, when QMV was invoked over the refugee crisis, it has seemed to have created a huge amount of bad blood, and it drains the reservoirs of goodwill that is the source of strength for the European Union. And these reservoirs are not bottomless. And I think that in the current times, the EU would perhaps be wise not to go down that path, because there are other challenges that need to be addressed, and the solutions will, in some cases, actually be equal distribution of misery, rather than the hopeful and upbeat messages that Federica Mogherini prefers to send out. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have 10 minutes for questions and answers. We've been working precisely as a Swiss watch, so we still have plenty of time, so please do not be... yes, please, there is a question.
Hello, I'm Vlad Galushka from the Open Society Think Tank Fund. I have two questions, one for Roozbeh and the other one for Raffaele. I really like your idea about direct democracy. I think there might be several problems with that. One of it is that it may fuel populism and come out at us from a very nasty angle. I'm not sure if we ask people, let's say in Ukraine or Georgia, about what they think on LGBT rights, which is part of the association agreement, that the responses we're going to hear are going to be the ones we like. And then the uncomfortable question will be, what do we do with that once we hear that they don't like it? And the second question is for Raffaele. You raised a really good point about working with civil society. And the problem that I think the EU is facing is that there is a difference between the organizations, civil society organizations that are rooted in the societies, and the civil society organizations that can implement EU projects. There is a huge difference in capacity because the first may be really genuine and very natural, but because they're so new and they're so disorganized that very often they simply don't qualify for very complex instruments that the European Union is pushing forward. So I was wondering if you have given any thought to how to marry those two in practice. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go first. In regards to a really great example of LGBT rights. I mean, we saw this in California in 2008. The state Supreme Court, reading the California Constitution, said there's a right to marry for gay and lesbian couples in California. This was before last year when the Supreme Court said there's a federal right to marry across the whole country. Within 6 months, there was an initiative to amend the state constitution to say that no, marriage is between a man and a woman, and it passed. So for about 6 or 7 months, gays and lesbians had the right to marry in California. Then it was taken away through direct democracy. So I absolutely take your point. With respect, though, if I can take my political scientist hat off and put my sociologist hat on, that's a question about society, though, isn't it? And that's a question, maybe things you do and things you're involved with, that's a question about changing attitudes in society, because you can give fiats from above, and you can maybe have direct democracy, you can maybe not, but it's not going to be enforced, and it's going to be problematic. I look to the Gay Pride Parade here, and I used to live and work here many, many years ago, and I remember the first time they had tried to have it. They weren't quite able to have it that first time, and a lot of bad things happened. Now, the past year or two, they're able to have it. And I would argue, and I think polling data supports this, there's been a change in societal attitudes in this country, the same way there's been a change in societal attitudes in my country, in my state as well. So I say these are two different things, but I absolutely take your point, and that's a fact. It's a danger, and we have to live with that society.
Well, one institutional response to your issue is precisely the engagement with society. I mean, this is already there. It's a EU policy. I mean, and this kind of participatory democracy from below, it has also, I mean, searched and tried, promoted through the engagement of civil society. The case of LGBT rights is very clear. It's there, and the money is provided to a number of NGOs throughout the world to promote those kinds of rights. Of course, I mean, that's dilemma, it's crucial, not only actually, I would say, in foreign policy, but also in EU governance. I mean, there is a kind of catch-22 situation. I mean, in principle, the EU would like, in its internal governance mechanisms, to include more rooted civil society in a more constitutive way. But then, at the end of the day, if you go to Brussels, you see the other kind of civil, more technical NGOs, professional part of the Brussels circle. So, I mean, it's not an exclusive problem for foreign policy. How to tackle this? Well, it's both a technical and a political issue. It's a technical issue because you really need to put in place a number of procedures to engage an open dialogue with local civil society. Not only, I mean, you set the agenda in Brussels, you go there and you look for somebody to implement it. That's where you will find the professional NGOs ready to do this. But this is, the point is, and it's why it becomes political, you need to be ready to reshape the agenda also through the dialogue with local actors. But then it's not anymore you only that decide things. I mean, there is a kind of political compromise, which is, of course, more difficult. But that's really the only way. I mean, you cannot expect to engage with rooted and, I would say, political civil society organization in another country and expecting you to be free to sort of impose your agenda without any political compromise. I mean, at the end, it's a political game, so you need to strike a deal and a compromise. But it's difficult, of course.
Thank you, thank you. Are there any more questions? We still have time for 1 or 2 questions, please. Please do use the opportunity to ask the panelists. There is one, yes.
Thank you very much for delivering these interesting presentations. I'm Marko Kovacevic, a doctoral student of international and European Studies at the Faculty of Political Sciences, University of Belgrade. And actually, speaking about European Union foreign and security policy and the need for new strategies, especially in 2015 and 2016 and the recent discussions, in trying to explain and understand the ways the European Union foreign and security policy frameworks work, how can we address this important empirical question with the relation to, let's say, the notions of ideas, identity, and power as such underlying factors that influence the foreign policy? decision-making and generally foreign policies of the European Union, member states, and the European Union as a whole. And could we draw the line or make a more nuanced response to this as to what degree ideas or identities or power influence the ways the security and foreign policy are going to develop in the years forward? Thank you.
Is this question asked to any particular panelist or to the whole panel?
All panelists are welcome to offer their response. Thank you.
So in this case, I'd like to invite all panelists to try to very briefly try to respond to either this question or to give some final remarks, as this is your last chance. And you would like to start? Yes, please.
Mic is on? Yes, now it's on. Just very brief comments about the question that was raised right now. I think that's the €1,000,000 question. How can we converge 28 strategic cultures, sometimes with very different perceptions on ideas, identity, and power? That's why one of my arguments was that the next strategic review must underline what is the EU's ethos, what is the distinctive identity of the European Union related to, compared with other international organizations, in order to converge in a common strategic culture. So I apologize, I don't have probably an answer, but I think that's a very important question that must be raised in the next strategic review. Just a very brief comment on the discussants' remarks. I understand when Jozef said that we shouldn't focus in academic discussion on what hybrid is. I think that was more or less your argument. And I agree. I even think that member states won't have time to discuss all the words that will be there in the strategic review. But I do think that if in 2003 the trendy word was multilateral, in 2016 the trendy word will be hybrid. And the perception of hybrid for the southern flank and for the eastern countries is very different, in my opinion. And I think that most of the current discussions among member states in the European Union, and also in NATO, in preparing the Warsaw Summit, is really upon this kind of discussion on hybrid warfare and on the strategies that must be developed for that hybrid warfare. But I also think, and I also believe that it was the point of your argument, that we should focus more important than focusing in the definition, we should focus in a comprehensive approach and in the need of the EU to do what the EU does better, that it is to address the structural causes of the fragility of the failed states and act in a preventive way and not in a reactive way. Because when we look to the current situation in the EU, when we think about the Greece situation, when we think about the refugees of Russia, what we think, at least what I think, is that the treaties are not enough to understand or to address the situation. We saw that in the Maastricht Treaty. When the Maastricht Treaty entered into force, the Balkan crisis was already a humanitarian disaster. So it seems obvious for me that the current instruments, the current treaties, and the current solutions are not enough to tackle today's challenge. And I know that the European project was also perceived as a small steps project, but it was also always perceived as steps further. And the fact is, nowadays, what we are witnessing is that we are giving a lot of steps back to try to understand and to respond to the situation, and member states acknowledge that the current instruments and the current solutions are not enough. And that's why most of the discussions are perceived as slow and the response is too late. And this is the major dilemma that the EU, in my opinion, will face in the next months for the strategic review.
Thank you very much, Raffaele.
Well, I mean, EU identity is pretty much clarified. I mean, if you take the entire EU legal set, that's it. But the problem is not the identity as such, is on the one hand the implementation. In principle we all agree, but then in practice when we need to implement specific policies, migrants, Russia and other issues, well then divergences emerge. So on the one hand implementation, and on the other hand we should reckon that of course this is a work, an endless work in progress. I mean, think about LGBT, the thing that we mentioned now. I mean, LGBT was not part of the EU package until a few years ago, and then through kind of lobbying in the EU, they managed to include this new issue with some resonance, of course, with the wider EU set of principles in the EU agenda. So, I mean, these things changes over time to some extent. Just 1 minute to reply to what you said. I mean, we should look at not only EU, but also the behavior of member states. I mean, this is, of course, very important. And there we find a much more diversified environment. For instance, Italy doesn't provide funding for any democracy promotion through any civil society abroad. Poland was one of the promoters of the European Endowment for Democracy, in a kind of forum shopping competition with the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, because this was very much focused over Eastern Europe, and one of the first funding was precisely to demonstrate over in Kiev in Maidan Square. Other countries have their own sort of bilateral funding for democracy promotion through civil society. So there it's a more complex, competitive environment. Yes, I should add.
Briefly, thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the comments. And I completely agree with you on the added value of the strategy. That it should be the added value of the External Action Service towards the strategy. But I have another point to make, and I think that the process of drafting the strategy can actually be more important than the outcome, because I wouldn't expect so much from the outcome, to be honest. And for me, my take is that if Mogherini managed to get the member states on board and to define the red lines, to define their ideas towards the strategy and towards the foreign policy, I think that would be a success. Since the 2003 strategy of Javier Solana was pretty much a single act of him, now we have a different process, more consultative and more encouraging the member states to involve. And as far as my experience is concerned, I have really had some difficulties to find people involved in drafting, in developing the strategy or in contributing to the strategy within the Foreign Ministry of Poland. So if this is the case in other member states, then I'm rather pessimistic.
Thank you very much. And Rudy, please. I'll keep it short. My answer is a bit of a cop-out answer, and it's an unrealistic answer because the drafting of these strategies and building these things and coming up with these things can't be put on hold. But I would say part of the problem is, and I see this where I live now in the UK, is that there's still a great deal of debates, a lot of it under the surface, but at least in the UK it's going to come above the surface within the next year when they have the referendum, about what kind of EU do we want. And UK, certain countries in South Central Europe want one type of EU, France and Germany seem to want one type, but then France wants another type, and then Germany wants another type within that relationship. And now with the refugee crisis, we see maybe there are a group of countries that possibly want a different type, although I don't think they're quite sure what type they want yet. So it's a cop-out answer, and these things can't be put on hold, but I think until the EU decides, and this will be a multi-decade long process, I imagine, what kind of EU, what kind of union does it want, you're going to have these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. With this, our first panel discussion concludes. I think personally it was very thought-provoking, very interesting, very good kickstarter, both for the other two panels of the academic session today, as well as for the whole Belgrade Security Forum. And more importantly, I really hope that some of ideas, both that were expressed today or in the papers, will be used in the High Representative strategic review process. And with this, our panel concludes. I'd like to invite you to give a round of applause to all the panelists. And I guess we resume in 25 minutes, and I guess coffee is served somewhere outside.